quick side note, this video is going to be rather different from my normal ones. A bit less professional, a bit less narrative, even a bit less Trench Crusade focused, if we're honest with ourselves, as the topic we're working with is largely theoretical and worth mentioning so that I won't have any nationalism in the comments. I will say this: Polish, Ukrainian, Rusian, Russian, Lithuanian, am I missing anyone? Ah yes, Belarusian and even Tatar are all perfectly normal in respectable cultures. Well, okay, maybe not Belarus. Why, do you ask? Well, because you see, I liked the old proposed flag for Belarus, and I'm not happy that they're not using it, because surely all countries can benefit from having a knight on their flag. I mean, okay, Lithuania wasn't doing it. You could have just kept it. Look at Slovakia. They saw that Hungary wasn't using the old cross, and so they decided, hey, why don't we just use it? Wait a second. Slovakia, just Hungary's version of Belarus. A topic for another day, I think. Let's focus on the topic at hand. There is, in Trench Crusade, in the map they released, a Grand Prince of Kiev, a Novgorod Tsardom, a Kingdom of Hungary, and a Polish Commonwealth, as well as Scythians and a Golden Khanate. Now, let's keep this in mind. This is a world in which there is no Ottoman Empire, a world in which the Great Schism would have been mended, meaning two things: the revolts of the Cossacks, or the Zaporozhians, are not Orthodox versus Catholic, as well as it's far, far less likely there's ever a Treaty of Pereyaslav, as the Zaporozhians do not have to seek Novgorod or Moscow. I mean, don't have to seek Moscow or Novgorod in this case. Side note, the defenders of the faith idea, probably still a concept for the Cossacks, as they are fighting what looks to be either two pagans or a pagan and a Muslim. Why is this important, you might ask? Well, you see, Cossacks were formed originally from quite a few different ethnic groups, mostly Ruthenians, Ukrainians, that sort of thing, and other Orthodox peoples and Tartars. But that changes depending on who you ask. Of course, I'm talking about Zaporozhian Cossacks here, not like Russian ones are a very different topic. We'll get to them later, if we get to them in this video at all. But a big part of it, like of the reason these people were fleeing into the steppe, was, adventure, raids, a desire not to be enserfed. Am I missing anything else? Hunters, outlaws, that sort of thing. Big part of it, though, was that Ukraine was difficult to govern, right? Be ye Turk, or Pole, or Muscovite, no man would find an easy job in governance there. So, according to the legend, they travelled further into the steppe, fleeing serfdom, and thrived as mostly Orthodox East Slavic language-speaking groups who lived and raided like the Tatar cultures around them, and thus begun, the whole border service thing. Plus, since they're Orthodox, you run into this kind of odd tension with the Polish government and the Union of Brest, right? And that kind of also played a role in why you flat out hear some stranger stuff appearing. Like some people say that there were no Orthodox or any clergy at all in Cossack lands. Mike Groshko, or Gorishko, I forgot how to pronounce his name. He says, open quote, "The Cossack way of life did not lend itself to religion. On their raids by land or by water, they plundered Catholic, Orthodox, Jewish, and Muslim without discretion. Conversely, they were prepared to welcome to their ranks anyone who could fight irrespective of creed. Even in relatively peaceful activities, they offended the teachings of most churches with their habitual drunkenness, their proclivity for rape and theft, and their general view that might was right. Though they did have a rough and ready morality, within their ranks. A male Cossack, for example, who murdered another might be sentenced by the elders to be tossed into a river bound to the body of his victim or buried alive. But in general, religion or moral teaching in any form was regarded as a sapping influence. Priests were specifically barred from the Zaporozhian Sich, and for a century or so, from 1550, there were no clergy amongst the Cossacks of the Dnieper or the Don. It was only the result of later religious upheavals in Poland and Russia that Cossackry came to be associated with Orthodoxy and its various forms. End quote. Is this true? And I got no idea, but I really doubt it. I mean, of course, some of it is true, right? Like the Cossacks accepting anybody into their ranks and their proclivities for theft and rape and overall war criminal behavioral traits, disgraceful as they are. But I really doubt, even during this time, that the kind of medieval hold religion had over the minds of peoples, be they outlaws or anything, could be made, like, gone, right? I mean, obviously, they wouldn't be very devout Christians if they were, doing all this. But there would always be that kind of concept of cultural Christianity. I feel a lot of people forget existed at this time, and especially in regions like Eastern Europe, and even kind of exist in the modern era. I mean, look at the 90s in Serbia, right? That same cultural Christianity that doesn't really prevent morality. I mean, that doesn't really bring morality or like prevent war crimes, just kind of, is part of the cultural concept of the locals, right? So like think about this, if you're Serbian and you're a kid, you grow up, even if you're an atheist, you're Orthodox, right? That's the whole idea. If you are in Croatia, right, and you're a kid, you're born, you're raised, you're Catholic, even if you're an atheist, you're still Catholic, it's just the way things worked. I mean, yeah, there's nuance. It's never 100%, don't get me wrong, right? Because, you could have a very devout chap, who actually is well read in such things and does keep to the ways of their respective religions. And then you can have people who are just like, oh yeah, I guess that's their religion. And then they go and do stuff like that. Or, like, you could just have like a proper, honest fellow who actually just fully admits to being an atheist, which I don't doubt there were plenty of Cossacks who were, like, man, okay, I love them as much as the next guy, but at the end of the day, there was a lot of behavior that can't really be considered the most Christian, right? Anyway, I find it very unlikely that all clergy were barred from the Zaporozhian Sich. I mean, look at any surviving or reconstructed Cossack Sich, there will always be a church, right? Especially in that area, it's very unlikely that they just even had the authority to kick out all clergy. I mean, who would back it, right? The Poles, probably not, and I don't know. I just don't really think so. Probably less priests, no doubt. But I mean, of course, there was still bishops and monks in around those areas. I don't know. I just don't think it's this kind of Soviet persecution that we see, I mean, like, without a doubt, they were shooting priests, be they Catholic or Orthodox. I mean, like, the Cossacks were a very wild and strange, terrible bunch on occasion. About some of the horrendous and disgusting things they've done to the Jews over time, it only makes sense they would inflict it on their own. But I think that Groshko, or Garashko, however you pronounce his name, is accurate when he says they didn't discriminate in their raids, early on. A lot of people argue that the sort of defender of the faith thing doesn't come around until the time of Khmelnytsky, which I myself have been never too able to know for sure, right? Especially when you consider the stories that are, like, he was supposedly very, Khmelnytsky, that is, was supposedly really well educated, right? And even the Cossacks themselves under Khmelnytsky were also well educated. Paul of Aleppo writes, open quote, "They are all, with very few exceptions, and even the major part of their women and girls can read and write." They know the church's orders and chants, and the parish priests teach the orphans and do not let them roam about the streets as vagabonds. End quote. Funny thing, before I talk more about this, the word Cossack technically does mean vagabond, just kind of funny to think about. Did this tradition, though, of literacy go back to the 1550s? I really don't think so. So, at the time, right, you can kind of attribute like literacy and stuff like that to a church education, which would typically, I mean, not always, but typically also mean kind of more devout. But look, I'm not here to judge people's religion, especially not back then, but just this idea of the well-educated Cossack, I, for all intensive purposes, really don't think we had in the 1550s. There is always nuance. Now, Khmelnytsky himself was well educated, very well educated. Whether or not that was in spite of or due to the fact that he's a Cossack, I am unsure. I don't really know enough to fully state that before Khmelnytsky, that was very much a thing. However, before you say it, yes, the Don Cossacks, I really do want to make a video about, but the problem is we have nothing on them in Trench Crusade. It's very sad. Anyway, in a world without a great schism to drive home what Khmelnytsky fought for in our time, it is more likely he is just revolting for independence or freedoms more than for religious reasons. This would mean he did not really ever need to swear allegiance to the Russian Tsar, if in this world, that is, there would be a Khmelnytsky at all. I believe they'll have, how do you say? I believe they'll have some Cossacks, right? Some Cossacks led by a hetman who was serving under a grand prince. I'll get to the other ones in the Trench Crusade timeline later. It's also quite likely, I think, within the Ukraine itself, the broader Ukraine, that is, I guess one could say greater Ukraine, that any Carpatho-Ruthenian or Rusian people would, in Ruthenian, of course, Ruthenian in general, outside of Carpathians, would still be there, but in the kingdoms of Poland and Hungary. Perhaps even Novgorod. I think that the Cossacks culturally maintain that free spirit and border service, but I think it's far less along the lines of, the ones we had in days of yore, say in the Russian Empire, right? And far more closer to the registered Cossack systems of Poland in the very early days, which is more like, Trench Crusade be like, fight the Golden Horde or the Scythians, and he will not be a serf. Worth note, by the way, is the crest used for them is the Petro Doroshenko one, meaning, so it's probably, likely that in this timeline, we saw a similar war between Poland and Russia attempting to divide the Cossack Hetmanate, right? And, since there's no Ottoman Empire for him to swear to, it's unlikely Doroshenko would receive the hate he originally refused for doing that, for swearing to them. So, probably his dreams of a grand independent hetmanate may be still a thing, but I still think that Ivan Serko and Ivan Marzapa would still be prominent figures. Now, of course, there is that amazing fan project, right, being done with, I think it's by a team in Ukraine, funny enough. So, just God bless these lads. They made some amazing works of art, literal art, with this armor. It's fantastic. The aesthetic is that kind of Zaporozhian Polish, or mostly Polish, but I know it bled into Zaporozhia and Muscovite culture, Sarmatism aesthetic. And it just has that with fire and sword, 1600s aesthetic. I just freaking adore, man. I like how the basic silhouette of the rank and file Cossack is in many ways kind of similar to the later Circassian / Caucasian dress pattern uniform we'd be seeing with the much later Cossack eras. And I just love it. Though, of course, this uniform itself not the one we see here, but the one that it's clearly drawing reference to, is not originally Ukrainian or even Slavic. It itself is a Russification of not necessarily even Russian, but mostly Circassian and Caucasian. It was adopted by the Cossacks in around the 1870s, I'm pretty sure. Maybe 1860s, most likely 70s, though. I also like the fact that they are dismounted and not using the Sashka, as the Sashka also came more involved, came more as a Cossack thing in the 1870s, around the same time that the Caucasus pattern uniform did, right? As well as the Papacha is notably absent and replaced by the Kalpak. And of course, they are, infantry here, as the early Zaporozhian Cossacks were predominantly infantry. Of course, yes, cavalry existed. Cavalry existed, but it was a heavily infantry-based force. You do see some records popping up on occasion of horse archery being practiced and such things. There was a very Tartar-influenced culture here, but it seems mostly infantry back then anyway. And this kind of Polish cult of the saber, worth mentioning, goes back a very long time, that whole old joke about the Polish guy and the Frenchman that I think needs no introduction here, but if you want, I will add something in the description of the video about the line. But it's not, I don't think anyway, related to the Cossack cult of the saber, at least from what I could tell. That's a much later addition to Cossack culture. Same with, arguably speaking here, the cult of the Papacha, right? The whole better to be beheaded than to have lost your hat. Again, a product of a much later time. Probably in the Trench Crusade timeline wouldn't have taken off the way it did, as Trench Crusade, takes mostly inspiration from the medieval and, puts it into a World War I context rather than showing the evolution of various kingdoms that led to the World War I world order. However, I was surprised to know that some stuff from the post-Khmelnytsky era is in the fan project, oddly enough, which is the idea that the Cossacks will be part of God's army when the Second Coming happens. I like that. That's a nice detail. Needless to say, these Ukrainians have done their research, and God save them for it. They made an amazing project here, and I pray Trench Crusade makes it canon. Oh yes, now for the heartbreak, with mentioning Rostov-on-Don does not appear to be under Novgorodian control, at least on the map. Meaning, and it breaks my heart to say, we will probably not be seeing any Don Cossacks at all, which is very sad. But we'll probably get a Russian equivalent to Cossacks, like equivalent Russian Cossacks through the Don. Maybe Kuban or something, I don't know. As it stands, though, I for one, think that, they won't just be selling figurines of random Russian cavalry or Ukrainian and Polish cavalry, just calling it Cossacks. They'll probably release right bank and left bank Cossack figurines at some point, right? Maybe of different hosts and stuff. But of course, due to the fact that there is no Don Cossacks, it doesn't look like Siberia has been conquered. I mean, of course, that makes sense, right? Because no Don Cossacks, no Timofeyevich. No Timofeyevich equals no Siberian conquest. Still, it's highly likely, I think, we'll see different Cossack hosts. But I don't think they will be set in the same cities, rivers, and mountain ranges we know them for, as it would be kind of a waste of opportunity to not sell figurines of, classic Cossack groups, right? I imagine they could do something with Polish bank Cossacks, Russian hosts, and then of course both sides would register Cossacks on the Kiev and Polish side, of course, but I imagine with Russia they'll probably do something with a couple of different hosts, and then have registered Cossacks similar to the 1600 system on the Polish and Ukrainian side. That's at least my theory. Now then, let's make an idea, a kind of Trench Crusade Cossack from the perspective we are now. And right now we are in Plato's bloody cave. Anyway, what I mean by that is, we're going to create a Cossack from the perspective of dwellers of that cave. We can see the shadows of them moving around, some ideas here, but we can only form an idea of what the Cossack would be based off these shadows. Now, first Cossacks, remember, right? They were Ruthenians, Rusians, Russians, Tartars, Greeks, Poles, sometimes. Am I missing anyone? Balts and Roman, maybe? Anyway, over time became mostly Ukrainian, right? Probably same thing here, with those early days being made up of all of those guys being runaway serfs, adventurers, soldiers, hydrux, daredevils, and such, stuff like that. I imagine it's just like in our timeline, over time, their militaristic culture forms from life in the border. They behave something like the border guards or the Habsburg Gelensers, right? Only far larger, far more influential, and they form their own culture from, even their own culture separate from the broader Ukrainian and Russian contexts, right? Anyway, the Principality of Kiev or Poland likely establishes a Cossack registry, just like in our timeline. How? Is there a hetman? Is the Grand Prince the leader of the Cossacks? I don't know. You are going to have to decide. Too hard to know. Now, another weird one is, did the Grand Principality of Kiev break away from Poland or Lithuania? Or even Novgorod? In a weird Rus civil war, maybe? Hard to know as well. Also, when is a registry made? Hard to know, but in my opinion, it's going to be around the same time as in our timeline. I think, anyway. Now, next question. Is there a Khmelnytsky or Khmelnytsky-like figure? I would think so, honestly. Of course, Ivan Serko would most certainly be a character, in my opinion, as he's a renowned sorcerer, and the writers of Trench Crusade are likely very aware of the Kartelniki, or the Chitelniki, however you pronounce it, and, they would not shy away from a chance to use an unironic sorcerer who cuts off his hand for ritual purposes in something like Trench Crusade. That's very much up their alley. Furthermore, the Cossacks are likely a vassal of the Grand Prince, at least from what I think, perhaps as loyal to him as they would be the Russian Tsar in our timeline. I also do think Cossack revolts will be breaking out on occasion, as that is kind of, how you say, a historical canon event, I have a theory, though, and this one is purely speculative, just because, I don't know, it just feels like it would end up being a thing. I think that there would end up being this grand Cossack rebellion, right, from, Poland to Ukraine to Russia, and, it would probably result in, a kind of Trench Crusade equivalent to the Treaty of Pereyaslav, where the Cossacks would end up swearing allegiance to the Grand Principality of Ukraine. I kept calling him the Ukrainian hetman on accident, but most likely this rebellion would have been led by a hetman, Anyway, I say all of this, right? But it may come, there may come a day when new information is released that proves me wrong. Who knows? I'm actually hoping we get more information to prove me wrong so that I can make more videos on this topic, as this is purely speculative. This whole thing is mostly, not purely, mostly speculative, as we're just looking at things on a map and then, just kind of theorizing what could be there. And of course, I could have gotten some details on Eastern Europe long, as I'm not a historian, nor am I really the world's greatest expert in Trench Crusade. So take everything I say here with a grain of salt. Get it? Ukraine, the breadbasket, grain. Oh man, screw it. I'll show myself out. Now, I had originally planned on doing this video in my older style, but the issue, of course, being there is not nearly enough content yet for that. Maybe one day.